So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. It is my great pleasure to being a chair of this session. Welcome to this special session titled From Ecology to Epidemiology, the 2025 CWS Woodroofe Awardee's Journey. It is my great pleasure to introduce this year's Michael Woodroofe Award recipient, Dr. Staci Hepler, who is an associate professor of statistical sciences at Wake Forest University. Let me begin briefly by introducing the Michael Woodroofe Award. The award was established in 2023 by the Caucus for Women in Statistics and Data Science, CWS, under the leadership of Dr. Dong-Yoon Kim, who served as a CWS president that year and was a former student of Professor Michael Woodroofe. Professor Woodroofe was a pioneering statistician whose groundbreaking contributions to sequential analysis, non-parametric inference, and stochastic process has had the lasting influence of modern statistics. He was also a deeply respected mentor, known for his intellectual rigor and generosity in young statisticians. The Michael Woodroofe Award honors a mid-career woman statistician and data scientist for outstanding contributions to real-world problem solving through innovative applications of statistical theory and method. This award embodies Professor Woodroofe's spirit of excellence, creativity, and mentorship, values that continue to inspire our professionals today. Dr. Hepler's career beautifully reflects this spirit. Her journey began in ecological and environmental statistics, where she developed the models to understand complex natural systems and has since evolved toward epidemiological and public health applications, including her impactful research on the opioid epidemic. Her work demonstrates how Bayesian modeling and spatio-temporal analysis can powerful bridging disciplines from ecology to epidemiology, offering insight into urgent, data-rich scientific challenges. In today's talk, Dr. Hepler will highlight key research projects across these domains and reflect on how statisticians' fundamental skills can lead to meaningful interdisciplinary impact and a rewarding professional journey. Please join me in a warming welcoming Dr. Staci Hepler, the 2025 Michael Woodroofe Awardee.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'll share my screens, my slides here. Let's see. Are they full screen for everybody? Does that look? Okay, I think so. Someone holler at me if they don't start turning. Thank you so much for that introduction. I was really honored to be the Woodroofe recipient this year, and it is a really humbling experience to then be asked to give a talk about, my career. Is definitely bringing up some of those old feelings of imposter syndrome a little bit, but I'm excited to do so today. And so, as was mentioned in the introduction, my career kind of shifted from studies in statistical ecology to public health. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey and highlight a couple of projects in those areas that I have worked on. And but first, I guess, since it's a little bit of a career trajectory talk, just kind of a brief background about me. I'm from Ohio. I got my bachelor's degree in mathematics education from Shawnee State University, which is a small regional university in Southern Ohio. I was on the soccer team there. I first learned about statistics during an REU at Miami University, the one in Ohio, not the one in Florida, between my sophomore and junior year. So prior to that, I had never taken a statistics class. And when I went to this REU, I was actually in the number theory research group. And one thing I learned during that REU was that I did not have a passion for pure mathematics. But all of the seminars that we went to, I found that when the speakers were statisticians, I was much, much, much more interested in what they had to say than the talks that were given by non-statisticians. So I went back to Shawnee State that fall. I was like, I want to study statistics. And so I ended up going on to Ohio State University, and that's where I earned my PhD in 2015. And so how did I get to this research area that I'm in now? Well, my dissertation work was actually in Bayesian uncertainty quantification. I was always interested in applications in environmental science and spatial statistics, and that motivated a lot of my work, but my work wasn't in like spatial statistics per se. And so when I joined the faculty at Wake Forest in 2015, I knew that I kind of wanted to shift research areas. Like so many people can probably relate, by the time I was done with my dissertation, I didn't really care if I ever saw that particular body of research again. I was kind of ready for something new and ready to get more into environmental statistics and spatial statistics. And it worked out perfectly because when I arrived at Wake Forest, my colleague Rob Earhart was advising a master's student, Bryant Davis. They were collaborating with Michael Anderson, who is a biology professor at Wake Forest. And they were looking at these models in statistical ecology for this fun application that I'll tell you a little bit more about. But when I arrived, they were just basically invited me to join right away. They were like, you're interested in environmental science. If you have interest in coming on this project, like we would love it if you would be part of the team. And so a little bit about what this project was. There's this collaboration was part of the Serengeti Lion Project, which is a project that's been running for many, many years out of the University of Minnesota, led by biologist Craig Packer. And the part of the project that the Wake Forest team was focused on was this part called Snapshot Serengeti. And so Serengeti National Park is in Tanzania on East Africa, and it's on the border between like Tanzania and Kenya. And the Snapshot Serengeti project, it is a camera trap study. And so at the time, at least when I was working on this project a few years ago, there is a grid of 225 cameras that were spread out across this large region of Serengeti National Park. So this map on the right, all the dots represent the locations where these cameras were located. And it's a little hard to tell from the map, but the cameras are about 2.5 kilometers apart from one another. So it's a pretty big spatial domain. This region covers a lot of different terrain. There are wooded areas, there are open plains. So it's geographically quite diverse. And from the dots on the map, you can tell it's pretty like close to being on a grid, but it's not exactly on a grid. And kind of the way the cameras were placed, if there was a tree nearby, the cameras were anchored to the tree. So plot on the figure on the left, you can see there's a camera anchored. If there's no tree nearby, then there's a pole. And then these cameras, they go off if they detect movement or if they detect something greater than ambient temperature. And the goal for our Wake Forest team was to use this information to study how the spatial distribution of herbivores in particular relates to environmental characteristics and also how it might relate to other species in the area. So what do these cameras capture? Here is a non-representative subset of some of the pictures that are captured by these infrared cameras. And so for the pictures here in the top row, we can pretty clearly and pretty easily identify what species were in that area at that particular time. It's not very hard to classify the elephant that is right in front of the camera. If you notice that the animals tend to be looking at the camera does make a clicking noise when it goes off. When it detects movement, it takes a series of like 3 pictures, like 1 second apart from one another. So that's why we get these nice looking animal selfies. But then we often have, or probably more often than not, have what pictures that look like what we see in the bottom row here, where if you squint and look very closely, maybe you can see kind of animals far out in the distance, but it's a lot harder to know, is there an animal there? What species is it? But this just gives you a sense of what the output from these automated cameras looks like. And so how does this turn into data that an ecological statistician might want to model? Well, this is a citizen science project. It's sponsored by the website Zooniverse. And so volunteers go through these images and classify the species that are there. This shows a screenshot of what the classification website used to look like for Snapshot Serengeti. And so a picture will show up, one of the pictures from the cameras. And there are some helpful identifying questions. You can click and say, does the animal have horns? And then like, what shape are the horns? Does the animal have a tail? And so as you choose some of these features that you observe in the picture, it will kind of narrow down what the possible species are that it could be. And then volunteers can look at pictures of these other species and decide, oh, hey, that's a wildebeest. And behind the scenes, there's this classification algorithm. The same pictures go to certain numbers of people. There has to be some level of agreement before they are decided to be classified. And so I won't get into all those behind the scenes details. But the result of what I end up getting as a statistician is a bunch of zeros and ones. I end up with binary spatial temporal data modeled on an 8-day time scale. So basically indicators of, yes, there was a zebra in this particular area during this particular time period. We also have information on environmental variables that might be of interest, NDVI, which is a measure of vegetation, distance to water, fire, termite mounds, and things like that. So most of my contributions in this line of work were related to what we call occupancy models. Occupancy models are then commonly used in statistical ecology to model presence or absence of an event, where the events here are presence or absence of a particular species being in some geographical region. These are used to model spatial binary data. And what these models do, these are hierarchical models that then account for imperfect detection. So as we saw from the pictures that I showed, sometimes it's really easy to classify the species that's in the image, but other times it's not. And so it could be that a particular species was in a given area in a given time period. We just didn't see it. And that's the main characteristic that these models then try to account for. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical detail in this talk, but just to kind of set up the modeling framework and set up some notation, give some background on what these models do. These models then make a distinction between Y, which is what we observed, 1 if we observed that particular species, 0 if we didn't. We make a distinction between that and Z. Z is whether the species actually was there or not. In the general hierarchical framework of these models is that we model Y conditional on Z. And so this allows for the possibility of there being false negatives in the data. So just because you did not see the species, that does not necessarily mean that it wasn't there. So the target of our inference then tends to be this parameter psi, which is the probability of true presence. We really want to understand spatial temporal trends and where the species actually are located. And this P is a detection probability. So it's related to why are we more or less likely to see certain species in different regions. Both of these probabilities can be parameterized with covariates. We can include random effects to account for things like spatial dependence and time dependence and so on. A couple of my main contributions then in this area, some of my earlier work really focused on the problem of identifiability. So it turns out it's really tricky to be able to uniquely identify all the model parameters. Since we have this hierarchical model, it can be hard to distinguish between probabilities related to true presence and absence and the probabilities related to detection. So much of the literature in the statistical ecology literature had specified these requirements that multiple replicates were needed in order to be able to uniquely identify all of these probabilities. And those requirements were just not often met in realistic applications. And so one of my earlier works in this area developed a spatial temporal occupancy model that accounted for some of these dependency structures. And we were actually able to show that our model allowed us to relax some of these previously believed assumptions needed for identifiability, which made these models more widely applicable to realistic scenarios. One of my other main contributions in this area was then to extend these models to the multivariate setting. Because kind of understandably, as one would expect, the presence or absence of one species probably depends on presence or absence of other species. Some species might tend to cohabitate together, or in the case of predator or prey, some species might want to avoid particular other species. And most of the work in this area had only considered one species at a time. So I also worked to extend these methods to multivariate settings so that we could capture within species and between species autocorrelation. This method was then applied to jointly study occupancy for 3 species: Thompson's gazelle, zebra, and wildebeest. We chose these 3 species because it was kind of established that they tend to migrate close to each other. And in this image, we can see there's a herd of wildebeest in the background, zebra kind of in the middle, and these cute little things up front are the Thompson's gazelle. Oh, I lost my pointer. And so the method that we established allowed us to quantify and also account for these between species correlation. We estimated very high correlation between zebra and wildebeest, which is aligned with our scientific knowledge of what we would expect to see, and even moderately high correlations with Thompson's gazelle. And this enabled us to get better predictions than what we were able to get for single species models. And this was showing the predicted probabilities for the 3 species across 5 consecutive time periods, where we have gazelle in the first row, zebra, and wildebeest. The coloring corresponds to the probabilities. The circles are where the cameras were located, and the ones that are filled in black are the places where we actually did observe the species in the camera. They showed up in the pictures. So I want to take a second to highlight a couple of my students who have worked on various problems related to occupancy models. Robert Sketch was an undergrad, one of the first students that I worked with, and he did a lot of the coding for these models. And so he ended up being co-author on a paper that was published in Science a couple of years ago, which is super amazing, super exciting. 2 of my former master's students, Bi-Ching and Xin-Yu, also worked on problems related to occupancy models, and big congratulations to them because they defended their dissertations this summer, and they both graduated from my alma mater of Ohio State. So kind of getting to the turning point, I presented some of my earlier work on occupancy models at JSM in 2016. And the session that I was in that year was the 12 o'clock session on Thursday, which those of you that have been to JSM know that is the very last session of the conference. And I was expecting absolutely no one to still be there, to be in the audience. And surprisingly, it was the best attended session that I have ever spoken at. And a couple of really important things happened in that session. One, I ended up meeting Lance Waller, who's at Emory University, who went on to become a collaborator. But after that talk, he invited me to come give a version of the talk at Emory, which I did later that year. Also after that talk, I had coffee with David Klein, who had been my colleague in grad school. We were in the cohort together, so he came to my talk just to, be a supportive friend. But we ended up having a really important conversation after that. So Dave and I were grabbing coffee after this session. Dave was a biostatistician who had just started collaborating with a couple of substance abuse and addiction clinicians who were interested in studying the opioid epidemic. And he asked, and this is not an exact quote, so bear with me, forgive me for paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, I wonder if these methods you're thinking about in ecology on imperfect detection, if we can use this idea in public health and in modeling these hard to reach populations where we can't observe the populations directly. We should write a grant. So we did. We wrote a grant. We came up with an idea of how to incorporate these methods. And we first applied for a 2-year R21 award from the NIH. The first round of reviews came back and said, it seems like a really good idea, but both of these PIs are really junior, and it might be too hard of a problem for junior researchers to do. So we had an idea like, well, we met Lance Waller. He was really supportive of our work. Maybe he would be interested in coming on a bigger role on this grant. We brought in Lance as a co-I. In the next round of submissions, the grant actually ended up getting funded. And this is how I got into public health. So I've been working on this problem then related to the opioid epidemic for the last few years. And one project in particular I want to highlight. And so I probably don't have to give a whole lot of background on the opioid epidemic. It's been a really serious problem. Ohio was one of the states that was hit the hardest early on, and that's where our data were coming from. That's the area where we were studying. And so what is one thing that's especially challenging about the opioid epidemic? We don't actually have data on what the thing we're interested in. It would be great if we had data on actual opioid misuse. How many people in a given small area are misusing opioids? If we had that information, we could better target areas for like resource allocation and things like that. But we don't have direct data on opioid misuse. Instead, we have data on different surveillance outcomes. In Ohio, we had data on fatal overdose deaths from opioid misuse, and also the number of people in given counties that were receiving treatment for opioid misuse. So both of these outcomes certainly are reflections of opioid misuse, but neither one of them are opioid misuse themselves. And so this relates back into that imperfect detection notion from these problems in ecology. The things that we observe are only capturing subsets of the population that we're actually interested in. We only capture the people who went on and had a fatal overdose or received treatment. Here are a couple of maps of what these outcome variables look like. Here is the treatment rate per capita. The data are censored, counts below 50, so that's why you see a lot of counties in gray. But we largely see treatment counts were increasing over time, especially in Southern Ohio. Similarly, the death rates per population were increasing over time, but in a slightly different way. At first, we had these really high death rates in Southwestern Ohio, kind of around Cincinnati, Ohio, and Dayton, Ohio. That's when like fentanyl came on the scene. And then you see that Southern Ohio really peak again. In practice, what is very commonly done is that researchers just model death rates. And they use then death rates as a proxy for misuse. And what are we doing if we use death rates as a proxy for misuse? If we assume death, well, probabilistically speaking, the probability of death would then be equal to the probability of misuse times the probability of death among those who misuse. So the death rate can actually change in a couple ways. It could be that the misuse rate changed, or it could be that the death rate among misuse changed, or it could be both. Now, we're actually interested in the probability of misuse. The death rate among misuse is really like a detection mechanism. But if we only look at death rate per capita, we can't actually distinguish between these mechanisms. And so we borrowed then from these methods in statistical ecology. In statistical ecology, abundance models are then used to infer latent size of population when you have imperfectly detected counts. And so we use this framework as our inspiration to extend these approaches in order to develop an abundance model in order to infer how many people are misusing opioids in different counties over time. And so I won't really get into the details because I know I only have a few minutes left here. The general abundance model framework, we assume that the counts that we observe, in our case, death and treatments, are from a binomial distribution, where this capital N is what we're actually interested in. That's the number of people who misuse opioids. For that capital N, we can assume some Poisson spatial rates model, where we have the state level rates of misuse, and we use data from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health to help inform that. And then we also have this lambda, which gives us our relative risk. In all these models, we can include covariates, we can include spatial and temporal random effects to account for the dependent structure. And we implement these models. Here is then what our estimated prevalence of misuse looks like. And so one key feature that I want to point out is we're actually estimating that misuse has largely been decreasing since 2009. And if you think back to pictures of, say, death rates and treatment rates, which were increasing, this might first seem counterintuitive. But what we also see is that the death rates among those who misuse was drastically increasing over time. And similarly, treatment rates among those who misuse were drastically increasing over time. And so a couple of takeaways from this project. We're estimating that prevalence of misuse actually was decreasing, but the rate of overdose was drastically increasing among those who misuse. And so our model allows us to separate out those effects. Whereas if we were just modeling death rate per population, we would come to a different conclusion. The work where we developed this modeling framework was published in JRSSA in 2023. But my favorite thing about this project has been kind of what it has grown into. After publishing that paper, at first researchers from NYU asked if we could do something similar in New York, and that ended up being published in American Journal of Epidemiology, and it was selected for an editorial. And since then, we've had 7 other states reach out and say, like, hey, we need prevalence estimates of misuse. Like, can you help us implement this for our states? And often as statisticians, it feels like we develop methods and they're not necessarily implemented on a broader scale kind of right away. So it's just been really amazing. It feels really good that people who are involved in like public health surveillance and making these decisions for their state are wanting to incorporate this work. I want to highlight a few of my mentees who have worked on this project. A couple might be on this call now, in particular, like Ji-Yoon and Ava. I think they're both on the academic job market this year, and they're both fantastic. And so much of this work could not have gotten done without them. So I'm just so grateful for them. And some of the papers that they've written. And so my like last minute here, just a couple of like what I've learned over the years. The benefits of collaboration. When I was at a point of career transition, I said yes to an opportunity with good collaborators. And if not for getting involved in that statistical ecology project, who knows what my trajectory then would have looked like. And so, we don't want to say yes all the time because that can also cause problems. But I have never regretted saying yes to good collaborators. And expanding your boundaries. So reaching across different sub-disciplines. So we got motivation for these problems in public health from statistical ecology. Now, no 2 problems are the same. Methods have to be adapted in order to fit your certain scenario. But by talking to researchers in other sub-disciplines, the inspiration might strike and you can come up with good ideas of how to solve problems. And lastly, maybe most importantly, is to pay it forward. If you are a mid-career or a more senior person, reach out to someone who is more junior, invite them to collaborate on this particular opportunity, because I think research momentum just then breeds future research progress, and just helping someone get a start in their career can then just have really lasting impacts. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hepler. Let's give up another applause and congratulations as a Michael Woodroofe Award. Thank you very much, everyone, to attend this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the IDWSS conference. Thank you.